Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor for HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. And this week's topic we'll be discussing, and therefore my lecture, is on industrialization at the end of the 19th, early 20th century in the United States. And I could have just easily called this lecture the emergence of the working class in 19th century America, because we'll talk a little about that here. And I'm not going to give a precise definition of class, but as you're going to see, it changes a lot. There's not like one definition of it, but we're definitely going to have the emergence of an industrial working class and definitely the emergence of an industrial labor movement as a result of what is a second wave of industrialization that takes place in the latter part of the 19th century. It already started before the Civil War. Industrialization in the Northeast, the Midwest, spreads west, slowly to the South. By the beginning of this period, beginning to have heavy industry coming to the South, but takes longer there. But this is the story of, we talked about the last couple of, first week, Reconstruction, how that was the intentional plan of the Republican Party, try to unify the country, economically speaking. We talked about settlement of the West, which is also part of that policy. The industrialization of the country is also part of the same policy. The growth of a national economy, making the nation more one so we can prevent conflicts, and creating a national economy. And creating a national economy, quite frankly, so you can compete on the world market, was in the minds of people running the country in this period. And what's going to happen, as you'll see, because you create a national market, you create a national economy, you're going to create a national working class, basically, that emerges self-consciously in this era. And there's a lot of things that go into this. So let's get started with the lecture itself. On June 21st, 1877, in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, Schuylkill it's pronounced Schuylkill, but it's spelled Schuyl, Schuylkill County. 6 Irish immigrants and 4 other men were hanged to death for murder in the region's coal fields. Coal mining, of course, being a big industry in Pennsylvania. They had been prosecuted as being members of a secret organization called the Molly Maguires. As you can see from this little newspaper photograph or cartoon drawing, before they were hanged, almost all of them received last rites from Catholic priests because they were Irish immigrants, and before they were put to death. And in fact, the Molly Maguires illustrate several different things that come together, the forming of a working class in the United States. One, of course, is immigration. They're immigrants, they're Irish immigrants. The Irish are looked down upon in the 19th century, both for cultural but also religious reasons. It's a Protestant country, they're Catholic. This is, the old United States, which doesn't quite exist anymore, at least not totally the same way, was run by, of course, Anglo-Saxon Protestants who look down on not just Catholics, but also Irishmen. They're barbarians, they're not civilized. Irish immigrants often found it hard to find jobs. You can find very easily, you can Google and find images of signs that said no Irish need apply in the 19th century. In fact, there was actually a song about this published in the 19th century called "No Irish Need Apply." I've heard a recording of it, so this is typical of their experience. And so a lot of immigrants, but also workers in general, would form organizations to help each other in the face of hostile ownership and governments that didn't do a whole lot for them. One of these was in the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is a working man's organization that's migrated from Ireland. And in fact, we think the Molly Maguires also migrated from Ireland. So the story goes, there was a widow in the 1840s in Ireland who was led the opposition to British landlords who were apparently, I can't remember the details, but I guess taking people's land, doing things, bad things with rents. And she led this movement and the name stuck, and they're called the Molly Maguires. They think this is what was resurrected in the coal fields of Pennsylvania. And in fact, these men were condemned in 1877. And by the way, over the next 3 years, 10 more men would be hanged for this. This was associated with the strike of 1875. There's a major strike in the coal fields. There'd been violence, fighting, bloodshed, and the press ate this stuff up. I might mention the Chicago Tribune wrote that, quote, "History affords no more striking illustration of the terrible power for evil of a secret, oath-bound organization controlled by murderers and assassins than the awful record of crime committed by the Molly Maguires in the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania," unquote. A Philadelphia newspaper expressed their gratitude for the, quote, "deliverance from as awful a despotism of banded murderers as the world has ever seen in any age," unquote. Other newspapers compared the Molly Maguires to the violence of the Ku Klux Klan in the South during Reconstruction. And they were right about one thing. There was violence in the coal fields. If you don't know, first of all, coal mining is really dangerous work. Deaths are common. You can die from black lung. Mines can collapse. Violence began in the 1860s, actually, in the coal fields. During the Civil War, 1862, against mine superintendents, owners, because of, again, low wages, poor working conditions. And in fact, we're not quite sure. We think those acts that were committed in the 1860s were committed by members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. But from that time up to the end of this conflict in 1877, something about 24 mine foremen and superintendents were murdered. And what happened, how these Molly Maguires were captured, is that in 1873, the railroad and coal companies who owned all these, mines, hired the Pinkertons Detective Agency. You don't know who the Pinkertons are. You can't do the history of the late 19th century without running into them. Pinkertons were a detective agency, more or less, not only detectives, they more or less loaned themselves out as private police to factory owners, mine owners, to help break up strikes. And so the Reading Railroad hired them to investigate this because they've been trying to find who was responsible for all this violence. And they sent a detective, another Irish Catholic immigrant, into the coal fields named James McParland, who worked undercover. And later, and his testimony is the sole evidence that convicted all 20 of these men who were actually murdered, actually executed, I should say. Now, the thing about this is that I say he was the only, his was the only evidence for this. In fact, the whole trial itself is amazing because it was conducted in federal courts or state courts, but the attorneys for the prosecution were actually attorneys who worked for the coal and railroad companies, if you can imagine. This is amazing. And again, a lot of the defense was that they basically were saying this guy was paid to make this stuff up. And in fact, for a long time, historians thought that maybe this was made up, and there was no Molly Maguires. And we don't know, by the way, exactly, because it was a secret organization. Secret for obvious reasons, to hide it from your employers, who might, might fire you and never hire you again, or worse. And in fact, we think there was some sort of organization, but eventually these men in 1979 were pardoned by the governor of Pennsylvania, particularly their leader, John Kehoe, pardoned as a labor hero because of all this, because of this pretty clear travesty of justice. Imagine, I don't know, Google or Apple or Microsoft bringing a lawsuit against a company for stealing one of their patents, and they're allowed to prosecute it in federal court with their own lawyers. That's what this is like. But the story of the Molly Maguires, by the way, there's a film about this, which isn't bad. It's made back in the 1970. Sean Connery plays John Kehoe in the McParlin is played by Richard Harris. Both passed away. It's not bad. It's a little slow for an older film. I actually showed it in one of my classes one time. It's a little slow, but it actually talks about this. They didn't just kill people. They blew up mines. But it's indicative of the whole period, of the need to organize in the face of hostility, if not outright. Well, sometimes violence against workers, but also they're violent too. Takes two to tango. And that is one of the things I'm going to emphasize here, is that the growth of an industrial power didn't happen without serious conflict. The age of United States coming into, and I shouldn't even say an industrial power. It will become the industrial power in the world by the end of this period. It will overtake Britain and Germany and all those countries. It becomes a behemoth. But it doesn't do so without a lot of, well, conflict, but also sacrifice. And in fact, the year of the execution of the Molly Maguire sees the beginning of the great age of labor conflict in the United States. From 1877 to 1914, on the eve of the First World War, there were nearly a half a dozen major conflicts in the industrial arena. You actually read about one of them last week, the Rock Springs riot. This is the riot by coal workers in Wyoming that killed a bunch of Chinese workers. That's one of them. But the first one actually begins the year they're executed, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is the first time, the first national strike, when all workers, left the railroads. And again, railroads are, think about that, what that means in 1877. Remember what the plan was of the post-Civil War governments, was to reunify the country. How do you do that physically? Oh, railroads. Again, railroads were at the heart of the growth of the West. This is a strike at that entire project. This led to massive confrontations with federal troops, but also between strikers and federal troops, but also militias, state militias. In fact, and by the way, these conflicts left more than 100 people dead. And in fact, it led to the creation of the National Guard. That's what the National Guard was created for. Not natural disasters, not stuff like that, putting down workers. Which they would throughout the rest of the period. Another one we'll get to in a moment is the Haymarket riot, but the next big massive strike was the Homestead strike. This is the Homestead Steel Mill of Andrew Carnegie Steel, one of the great barons of industry of the late 19th century. He has his Pinkerton men go down and put down a strike. Massive violence. 12 people die in the ensuing conflict, 1992. A couple of years later, there's a massive strike of Pullman porters, Pullman rail cars. Again, railroad industry, which goes on for several months. 30 people die in the violence of this event. Moreover, they caused $80 million in damage. That's a lot of money in 1894. I don't know what it would be in today's money. That's big money. And in fact, the president at the time, it was put down again by the National Guard, this strike. It caused the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, to establish Labor Day. That's right. Labor Day isn't just a nice holiday you get off. It's because of all this. And then finally, the biggest amount of violence was the so-called Ludlow Massacre of 1914. Again, the National Guard went into camps that were established in the Colorado coal mines, killed 24 men, but also women and children, which is why it's called a massacre. And that itself was the culmination of a year-long strike among miners in Colorado, which left between 70 and 200 people dead. So again, this isn't quite the level, this isn't, Reconstruction level violence. It's definitely not the violence level of the Western, conquest of the Native Indians, but it's in that line, right? This drive to create a national, a more unified nation, takes aim at workers and their demands in this period. So to me, again, I'm seeing continuity here, which is why I put them together this way. And here's just a picture from your textbook, but it's an instance of what kind of thing is going on. This is again, these people are miners, use dynamite, coal miners, so they know how to do that. So you take their skills and they use them against their employers. Now, need to go through some other things before talking about all that fun, violent stuff. One of which is the rise of modern industry in the 19th century, because things are going to change radically after the Civil War in the United States. And one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have the creation of a new type of business, the corporation. And the United States has become an industrial power by tapping all those natural resources, especially in the West, and steam, electricity, all that stuff, use of coal power, all those other sorts of things. In the process, you're going to have to harness all this. You're going to have to harness, what kind of, it's hard to have an organization that can deal with all these other sorts of things, at a level of a continental nation now, right? Because that's what the goal was amongst these business leaders, politicians. So you need a new type of, and this didn't happen intentionally, the growth of this particular system. It happens, several things went together, but you had the creation of a new type of business. One of the people responsible for this is a Swedish immigrant named Gustavus Swift, cattleman, cattle buyer, cattle meat packing industry in Chicago, who is responsible for creating the vertically integrated firm, the vertically integrated business, which the whole idea of what vertical integration means is you put within one business, one entity, one structure, all the functions of an industry, from processing, from creating, processing, distribution, everything, all under one roof. And you basically do this so you can control the whole process. And the same way, and by the way, he's the one, for example, who invents the assembly line. So you can make every part separately, that sort of division of labor, but bring that under one roof, as it were. And he also used, predatory pricing. When you do all this, when you control so much, you can lower your prices, you can aim at smaller competitors who can't compete, and then swallow them up to gain control of the market so you can dominate it and make more money. And he was not the only one who had that flash of insight. Because what he's doing, of course, you're trying to create or identify a market that's huge in scale. Scale's a big part of the story. And if you think you can reach an entire continent, you develop a national enterprise that can sort of serve it. The other person who's important in this is John D. Rockefeller, because his Standard Oil Company pioneered the opposite concept of horizontal integration. What is this? This is the idea you create a national distribution system for oil. And what it means is you make deals with railroad executives so you get better shipping rates so that you can outbid your competitors. And then once you've done this, basically once you tell them, look, we can undercut you and destroy you, you invite them to merge with you, which is to say you intimidate them the way that Swift did with his competitors so you can create a monopoly and dominate the market. In the 1880s, 1882 actually, the lawyers for Standard Oil created a new legal entity, the trust. And what the trust was, owners of a corporation charged a small group to hold stock from several different firms and companies and manage them as one entity. So you can enable a different number of firms as one company. So again, you can have a company that specializes in distribution, and then when it specializes in all the other things, still under one roof, basically. And this allowed him, along with this horizontal integration, to dominate the market. By 1895, Standard Oil controlled 95% of the oil capacity in the United States. And these trusts, of course, helped corporations, which is a new type of business, dominate industry. By 1900, America's largest 100 companies controlled 1/3 of the nation's production capacity. And by the way, if you're wondering what kind of business did you have before this, again, more like you have one business that did one thing. Also, again, instead of having, a board of directors who runs a company, they were family firms. That is the model. I'll come back to this in a moment. Hugely important to understand because that's the way most businesses worked And in fact, we'll talk about this a couple of weeks later about it changes the way people work for a variety of reasons, but it's a huge change. And of course, this is going to lead to massive, massive complaints and calls for reform because, of course, they're dominating all these markets, the age of monopolies. In fact, it's in the 1930s that they'll get the name robber barons. These great, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and the reason why, of course, is they're so dominant in the market. In the 1930s, historians during the Great Depression are looking for a reason why that happened. They're looking back and saying it must have been all this wicked drive to dominate everything. And that is definitely part of what this is use the word Gilded Age. You haven't heard that term before. It's Mark Twain's his name for this age of scrambling for wealth and dominating everything this way. So you have all this wonderful integration stuff, building trust. Well, you have to have customers. And again, people aren't, one thing you have to understand, we aren't by nature customers. We're not consumers. You have to create that. And so what happens is you have businesses creating markets. How do they do this? Well, you again, in the same way that you create a vertically integrated company that has all the things under one roof, you can create a type of business that sells things all under one roof. We call that a department store. John Wanamaker, 1875, Philadelphia, pioneered the department store. Again, putting all sorts of junk under one roof, dry goods, this, that, the other. Again, people didn't do that before the late 19th century. And chain stores, national chain stores, have had those before, such as A&P's and Woolworths, become prominent across the country. So you do it this way. You also go find consumers where they're at. Okay, you starts obviously in cities, most of these developments, but there's plenty of untapped people with money out in rural areas. How do you get to them? Mail order companies. Montgomery Ward and Sears, Roebuck developed a national mail order chain in order to find people. They've got money. They'll buy our junk. How do we know we'll buy our junk? Well, you can get them to buy their junk. You can convince them. How? Advertising. This is the first time, you got all this, idea for a national market. You go look and try to identify consumers through research. Modern advertising emerges as an industry in its own right after the Civil War. By 1900, companies are spending, it is basically a $90 million a year industry in newspapers and magazines. Making the press into a mass market industry. This is the beginnings, by the way, of a mass market media, mass media. It's only in the 1850s that the steam press gets invented. And again, this means nothing to you because everything's digitized today, but paper press, it was actually hard. It was expensive, was my point before the invention of the steam press to pump out, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies of stuff. But after that, it became possible. And with this need for advertising, it made cheap newspapers boom at the end of the 19th century. And of course fed into things like mail order companies. By 1900, there were 1,200 mail order companies in the United States. The biggest of them, Ladies' Home Journal, which should give you an idea who they're targeting as customers, women, middle-class women, had 3 million subscribers by 1903. So advertising works, as you well know. And one of the things about all this is that all this is meant to create as many consumers as possible, to create as big a market as possible, and produce things in mass quantities. Why? So you can lower prices, so people can buy more junk. And again, this does make, we'll show you a graph in a second, this makes more stuff more available to middle-class people. This has generally been the trend in American life ever since. But it's part of that sort of economy of scale we've talked about already. It's part of that general drift toward that. And again, this goes back to, I'm trying to link this with my earlier lecture, Reconstruction and settlement of the West. Part of the reason you create a national economy is so you can compete globally. So this is a scale beyond the national as well as in that regards too. Then finally, you have massive change. You have massive changes in the workplace. You have in the rise of the corporation. I mentioned this earlier. Just a massive change because before the Civil War, most people worked as farmers, or they ran businesses inside their own, out of their own homes, or they were independent craft workers, a master craftsman who might work that way. And what's going to happen by the 1870s is a shift that's never really been reversed. Is that like maybe today with offsite learning and Zoom and all that stuff, but is that for the first time in history, most Americans worked for someone else. Before the Civil War, most people did not do that. This is a huge change. This is a result of industrialization, the growth of factories and companies, and especially the growth of the corporation, because it creates a whole new class of people, managers, middle managers. It creates people who are there to, govern people doing all different activities like purchasing and accounting and auditing and handling that sort of thing. And therefore creates new class distinctions. And the class distinction becomes embodied in these terms you may not have heard, and they're out of date now, but white collar workers who work in an office with starched collars, doing things like auditing and stuff like that, and differentiated from blue collar workers who work on the shop floor. And so you have a real visible divide now between those who manage and those who work with their hands. And all of this, I might add, by the way, the models for all these vertically integrated corporations is almost always the railroads. They're the ones who actually pioneer this stuff. They have, headquarters for their big corporations that house executives, all these departments. And so this creates that. You also have the creation of another class of employees, basically female secretaries. Again, that's probably not a stereotype that fits anymore, but for a long time, this was the stereotype. And this was different. Before the Civil War, most clerks at business firms were men, young men. The reason why? Because you start out as a clerk, you rise your way up through the ranks, and you can get a better job that way. Just think about. I'm trying to think of something here. Oh yeah, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is Britain, but it's the same deal. Bob Cratchit works as a clerk for Ebenezer Scrooge, and the idea, Scrooge wasn't such an awful person, was to work your way up eventually. The thing is, in a large corporation, again, they're no longer family firms, no longer run personally by one person, they're run by a big board of people very impersonally. And so therefore, secretaries multiply, they become expendable, it becomes a dead-end job. And so employers want to assign it to people they don't care about, who they can pay less. Who's that? Women. But you can pay them less. By the end of the 19th century, nearly 80% of all stenographers and typists were women. By 1920, they held half of all basically entry-level office type work. And so these were some of their opportunities outside of the home. Other stuff would be domestic service. And again, the rest would be working, another third in industry, another third would work in office work, teaching and nursing and stuff like this. And this is another part of all this. You have a tendency by corporations to do what we call de-skilling of labor. What does this mean? Skilled craft workers always retained more autonomy in many industries. Why? Because their work takes more skill, they can demand more money, they have more leverage. But as production becomes standardized in factories and in various industries, as technology is used to do more and more work, therefore you don't need as much skill, this changes the nature of this. This is what the skilling of labor means. Mechanized manufacturing that was pioneered by people like Henry Ford, mass production, is basically going to, it's going to basically change the way people work, and it's going to take away their power, basically, in economic terms. As someone in your textbook, they quote a worker as saying, A man cannot, quote, be a master of a craft, only master of a fragment in this modernized workplace. You're no longer able to create something from start to finish. You create one little part because of the division of labor and the assembly line. And of course, that means we can pay you less, and therefore your life is more precarious. And by the early 20th century, you have even people in America going even further than this. They developed techniques of what they call scientific management. This is associated with a guy named Frederick Taylor, no relation to me, by the way, which sometimes literally meant making work more productive by being more efficient. This meant, in certain instances, literally people standing over workers with a stopwatch, trying to judge how fast they work. And if they work faster, get more done, give them more money. And as I kind of understand, this worked terribly because, of course, people don't only care about money. There are other things they want out of work. But it was deeply resented by workers. And it definitely had an effect because, of course, now you can pay people less. This means, of course, more women and children in the workplace because they're always unskilled and you can pay them less. And their presence, by the way, is very much resented by men. I mean, women's presence, because they're undercutting them. Also, working class people tend to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? In today's jargon, I don't know what the word is, not necessarily patriarchal, but it's a very male space. And so they resent that as well. It's also the reason why labor unions become outspoken against child labor. Not necessarily for humanitarian reasons, although a lot of them did. It's because it's a threat to their work. By 1900, 1 of every 5 children under the age of 16 worked outside the home. And then finally, in this de-skilling of labor, at the bottom of the pile, as always, are African Americans who get paid less, who are hardly able to work in certain industries because of racism. And so this affects all of them, a sort of cascading effect. And of course, people at the bottom in these industries, one way, by the way, to define, class, like working class, one way to do this is if your industry is, if there's a lot of, physical risk involved, you're working class. The steel and coal industries were highly dangerous, still are actually. 25% of immigrant workers died or were disabled in the Pennsylvania steel industry in the later part of the 19th century. Some 2,000 people a year died in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. And this is compounded by the fact that there aren't a lot of laws, effective ones, to ban working hours. There was a national law passed by Congress in 1868 trying to limit work hours to 8 hours a day. It was completely ineffectual. The average work day for most people was 10 hours. Average work week for most was 6 days a week. And there's almost little to no regulation for safety as well. And of course, death or injury spells disaster, especially during times of depression, which there were several in the 1870s and again the 1890s. So this is a bad time to be an unskilled worker, I should say. And here you can kind of see the big national plan working itself out. This is gross domestic product, and along with prices, going from end of the Civil War up to 1900, you kind of see the plan worked overall for these politicians and businessmen. It did do that. It did made America wealthier on the whole. And you can kind of see prices going down. They spike up in the late 90s, though, because of the Depression. Even so, the GDP overall, the country gets wealthier. It just doesn't happen equally and hurts certain people more than others. And here we have a picture of child labor. This is from a book by Lewis Hines. You'll have a picture of his your first writing assignment will be about this sort of thing. He published an expose, a photographic expose in 1903 about child labor. This is famous. You can kind of see what the working conditions are like, how nasty they are, how unhealthy they are. And this is the kind of thing, again, when you see a picture like this, you have to remember, okay, who is being published for? This isn't being published, for working class people because they, some families might have to have their kids work for them to make ends meet. No, it's being published for middle class people to try to tug on their heartstrings. Look what you're doing to the children. Middle class people are a lot more sentimental about their kids, generally speaking. Um, and so that's what these things. That doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting working class people didn't care about their kids. They did, but again, it was a necessity for them. But this is meant to bring that to light. As you kind of see, there's a guy in the background looking. He's like, "Look at that! What are you taking the pictures for? Get out of here!" But that's again part of this movement at the end of the 19th century, to curb all that and to raise into consciousness of it. And so the whole point of all this is you have this creation of everything's getting bigger, becoming under one umbrella. Industries coming under one, parts of industry coming under one roof, all industries coming under one market, one marketplace, one national economy. Well, if you create a national economy and do it on the backs of people who are not getting paid much, you're going to create a national labor movement, which is what happens. The national working class. There have been, labor trade unions, there have been craft unions before the Civil War, but again, industrialization hadn't spread very far outside the Northeast, to a certain extent the Midwest. As that became more widespread, you get people becoming more active. They realize they have common interests. And so you have political alliances emerge in the 1870s. And again, it first enters people's minds, the public minds in a big way in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Again, there's a depression. They're protesting wage cuts. And again, like people walk off the job. And I need to stress that this scared the living hell out of people in 1877. Again, remember, the railroads are what's supposed to make the country one whole thing again, physically speaking. They're also, middle-class people, and again, I guess it's still the same way today. They live very segregated lives. They don't know many working class people. So when they see them out there protesting, doing stuff, I'm thinking, of course, today we have, in next door in Canada, we have a bunch of truckers using the same tactics to try to force the government to stop their mandates. But that's a similar thing. You're using collective, what labor activists call direct action, to try to get results. And as a result of those physical conflicts, you also have workers being fired, being blacklisted. Railroad companies start circulating do not hire lists, prevent them from having work. It's hard to understand, by the way, in this day and age, how frightened people were of this. Newspapers were, horrified by, it's like, this is revolution, right? This is what they're worried about is communism. We'll get this in a moment. But it's this sort of thing that happens. You have 37,000 strikes between 1881 and 1905. This is in some ways, the golden age of the labor movement, fighting back against all this stuff. And it will actually emerge, I say nationally, not only will urban workers do this, rural workers will be a part of this new labor movement. And just to give you an idea, and again, I won't go into this too much detail, agrarians and farmers advocates are going to be protesting domestic policy in the 19th century. I mentioned this earlier briefly in passing. Large corporations get the benefit of tariffs on foreign imports to protect national industries. But this tends to drive up the cost of necessities while failing to protect other America's rural exports like crops and cotton, wheat, stuff like that. So you have rural workers especially becoming really pissed off, and they begin to founding organizations like the National Range of Patrons of Husband and Industry in the 1860s. These farmers were especially, they hated the middle management types that the new corporations created, corporate middlemen. They started to get around them through cooperation and mutual aid type stuff. And they formed parties like the Greenback Labor Party, which had some success in the 1870s. And they subscribed to an ideal what we call producerism. They hated bankers and lawyers and investors, so they believed that producers should share common goals and have established cooperative exchanges and stuff like this. And in fact, they have some success at the state level. By the 1880s, they 29 states have passed railroad commissions to supervise railroad rates and policies. This is a big problem with these farmers. They're worried about getting screwed in terms of shipping rates. So other commissions are formed. And there are a bunch of antitrust laws that are passed in the states by the 1890s to prevent monopolies, but these aren't always effective, but they'll be the starting point for later reform, as we'll come back to here. But again, to go back to, okay, why this labor movement causes such terror in the hearts of middle-class people, to give you some comparison, one thing newspapers actually invoke in 1877 during the first great strike, the railroad strike, is the Paris Commune of 1871. What's the Paris Commune, you ask? Funny you should ask. The Paris Commune was a brief seizure of the national government by radicalized workers and National Guardsmen in Paris in 1871. Long story short, the French had gotten beaten pretty badly in a war by the Prussians, and some of the guardsmen within the National Guard were working class, and there was a bunch of, like 50% of the industrial working class resided in Paris in the 1870s, and so they basically took over the government. They forced out the government. They had to flee and go to another city, and tried to establish, this is called the Paris Commune, because they try to establish what essentially is something like a socialist or communist form of government. They only last a couple of months. They start executing people, by the way, to these radicals. They execute a couple of bishops, Catholic bishops. So it terrifies the living hell out of people. And eventually the French government recovers. They send the army in. They kill a bunch of them, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 communals, as they're called, are put to death. So, in other words, revolution scares the living hell out of these people in America. They're frightened of this. And one of the things, of course, that's happening in the 19th century is you have the ideology of revolution becoming very popular because of this guy, Karl Marx, and his awesomely awesome beard. Of course, writes his Communist Manifesto in 1848 during the great revolutions in Europe in that time. Actually doesn't have much influence until 1871. He gains notoriety partly because of his support for the Commune, and it's then that his ideas start spreading a lot to workers' parties throughout Europe. And so that's what they're thinking of in the United States, even though, of course, we'll get to this in a moment, I guess later lectures, there'll be a socialist party in the United States, even an American Communist Party. They never had much influence for a variety of reasons. There's never a revolutionary working party. Well, there are, but none with any influence. We'll talk about some of this in a moment, but socialist parties or communist parties in America are kind of like, if you've ever heard the phrase of Karl Marx about clothing and naked people, what did he say? He said, clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence in society. That's kind of what the socialist parties are like in this country, for a variety of reasons. But still, in the minds of people looking at these protests, they're like, "Oh my God, they're gonna cause a revolution. So we have to get that under control." Nonetheless, you begin to have labor movements forming, and the focus for this up to the 1880s, middle of the 1880s, is one group in particular called the Knights of Labor, which was founded in 1869 as a secret society of garment workers in Philadelphia. Again, secret because they had to keep things secret from their employers. Unions were legal, but still there wasn't a whole lot of, again, enforcement of your rights to strike and stuff like that. And by 1878, it begins to emerge as a national movement. And it's a movement, if you read its materials, it appeals very much to American ideals of, like the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal, egalitarian ideals. It appeals to the Bible. It actually has, if you don't know, the movement sort of overlaps with the temperance movement. It's one of its famous leaders, Terence Powderly, was someone who advocated temperance, which is, suppression of drink. And it was originally intended to set up sort of cooperative set of factories owned and run by employees. By the early 1980s, it had taken on more and more trade union activities. They began to strike, and they won. a lot of strikes, got stuff from their employers. They membership rapidly increased, and one of the reasons they increased so heavily is they were a fairly inclusive organization. They allowed both skilled and unskilled workers in their membership. Why is that a big deal? Because again, generally speaking, in terms of negotiating with employers, skilled workers have much more power. But they didn't discriminate on this basis, so it pulled up everybody in the union, and even allowed women and African American to be members. So it was fairly progressive, fairly egalitarian in that regard. Also fairly decentralized. The one exception to this is that they came out in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The 1882 Exclusion Act was an act to exclude Chinese immigrants from competing with jobs with native workers. That was their one sort of exception to that rule, but it's part of the reason why they grew so rapidly. And they came out in favor of a bunch of different things to help laborers, especially unskilled laborers. They favored an 8-hour workday. They were against child labor. They were for corporate regulation. So they had a whole fairly ambitious program on the rise. What happened is to begin to undermine their campaign in the 1880s. In the 1880s, the 8-hour workday becomes their major sort of rallying cry. Is that you have a massive, because they're having more and more strikes, they're getting bigger and bigger. Is the infamous Haymarket Square riot of 1886, where a bomb went off and killed 7 people. I think it's four cops and 3 civilians. Which Chicago, this is in Chicago, Haymarket Square. If you don't know, Chicago was sort of a hotbed of political activism, and in fact, anarchists were blamed for this this riot and this explosion and these deaths. There's still some suspicion that it was actually a false flag operation done by police to try to break up these unions. I don't really know, but in the aftermath of this, authorities and employers seized on anti-union sort of hysteria to break strikes more violently. You get something like the Homestead strike in 1892, to force workers to sign contracts renouncing union membership, compiled more blacklists, and it damaged very badly the Knights of Labor's reputation because they were involved in that strike in 1886. And so their membership dropped by 20% in 4 years following the Haymarket incident. And then finally, in all of this, you also have the Knights of Labor working with rural people, rural activists. And they formed a movement called the Farmers Alliance in the 1870s in various different places. In the Midwest. In Texas, is actually formed during the Depression of the 1870s, spreads across the Great Plains, even gets into the South, and is the largest farmer-based political movement in American history. And they hinged their hopes on cooperative stores and exchanges that would circumvent, again, banks and things like this. You didn't have to get screwed over by banks charging outrageous interest rates for loans and stuff like this. These co-ops were meant to sort of get farmers to buy in bulk at wholesale prices, trying to pass the savings on to farmers. They didn't really work. They suffered from underfunding, lack of credit. And again, of course, they were also facing hostility from the businessmen they were trying to circumvent, who didn't like this very much. So this is sort of aimed at corporations trying to get around their monopolies. And they failed mostly in Texas by 1891. And what happened is you had state laws that had been passed to try to weren't working in these states to try to, in terms of trying to get decent rates from railroad companies and stuff like this. And so you began having the Farmers Alliance, as I mentioned before, beginning increasingly to work with the Knights of Labor and other urban workers who shared their vision. They did have some successes. In 1887, Grover Cleveland signed 2 bills into law, the Hatch Act, which tried to provide federal funding for agricultural research and education. This was a demand of the farmers. Also, the same year, they passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which again was a result of labor pressure from farmers and labor. The idea was meant to regulate, again, railroads. For example, railroads, again, with people like the Carnegies and Rockefellers, would make secret agreements for setting rates. And the new law forbid this, but it was very hard to enforce, obviously. And in fact, at the same time, the Supreme Court eroded the alliance's powers. In the 20th century, the ICC would become very powerful. The Interstate Commerce Commission would. But in the event, by 1890, the farmers had gotten fed up. And that's why in 1890, they form a national party, the People's Party. That's populism. We'll get to that in a few weeks. In any event, after 1886, the labor movement begins to take a different tact because of the backlash following the Haymarket riot. You begin to have probably a battle between organizers themselves. You begin to turn away from politics, and in particular, you have skilled groups of skilled workers organize trade unions nationwide. And instead of focusing on activism, trying to force employers and the government to do something for them, they begin to pool their resources and their skills and focus on getting narrow concessions from workers. These trade unions set up closed shops with all jobs reserved for union members and keeping out lower wage workers. And in fact, someone who came from the Knights of Labor, a man named Samuel Gompers, who organized the American Federation of Labor in 1886. And he persuades a bunch of these Knights of Labor to create this new organization. And Gompers' major idea is what he called pure, simple unionism. And the idea was, again, to reject the Knights of Labor's focus on strikes and politics, instead focus on what he called pure, is, let's say, limited to workers and particularly skilled workers who have something to bargain with, but also to focus on simple, concrete, immediate goals, achieving shorter work hours, increased pay, stuff like this. And this worked well if your union is limited to skilled workers, because again, you have more leverage. By the time he retires in 1924, he's turned into the biggest labor organization in the country. The AFL by 1904 has over 2 million members, and it will become the leading voice for workers. Still exists to this day as the AFL-CIO to this day. However, it has again several downsides. One is it basically shuts out unskilled laborers. It doesn't have much to say to unskilled laborers. It has no room, by the way, for the new service workers, department store clerks, or farm workers, or domestic servants. It's much more narrowly organized. And even though it does, basically Gompers is open about this. Gompers, by the way, is actually a Brit by birth. He's from London, but migrated to the United States, got involved in the cigar making industry, which again, another, rough kind of industry, and was concerned most about getting a share of all that wealth that was being created. It was also less inclusive otherwise. Blacks, women, generally speaking, not allowed, more racially exclusive. And so the narrowness of its base will come back to haunt it much later on for a variety of reasons. But it represents a shift in the 19th century. And so again, one of the reasons why you don't get, a revolutionary movement out of all this like you would have in other parts of the world. Here, just a little picture here. This is the seal of the Knights of Labor. You can see, look at the actual symbol there. That is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all. It's that very, very egalitarian ethos there. January 1st, 1878, its founding date. And this is a preamble of the Declaration of Principles of the Knights of Labor. It lays out, of its principles, and this is something you have to go through if you join the Knights of Labor. If you don't know, again, this originated as a secret organization. A lot of these things proliferated at the end of the 19th century, but there's all these sort of secret signals you have to do, secret handshakes and stuff like this, at least before it went public. But again, secretive because they were, being secret from their employers who were trying to break them up. And then finally, just a couple of images of the two great labor leaders of the late 19th century. On the left, you have Terence Powderly. Terence Powderly was he wasn't the founder. A guy named Uriah Smith founded the Knights of Labor initially, but he became their leader. Terence Powderly lived in 1879, led them through their most productive years. That's him on the left there, a picture from 1890. And on the right-hand side, you have Samuel Gompers as a young man. You sometimes see later pictures where he's much more dignified looking. This is him in his earlier days, kind of rough and tumble. And as you can see, people had some really killer mustaches in the 19th century. But again, this is them, the men who led these movements, which could be rough. You had to play rough with these people because we were talking about sometimes, a lot of the times, people who didn't have laws to restrain them and who had lots of power and money to use against you. And this here, I'm going to play a little bit of this just to give you a sense of this. The campaign to get an 8-hour work week, which, by the way, they wouldn't have effective laws against limiting work hours till the New Deal in the 1930s. This produced a whole raft of labor protest songs. And I thought I'd play one of them here. It's called 8 Hours. It's about the 8-hour work week. If you download the lecture slides, you'll find the actual words to this on the slide. But I'll play a little bit of snippet of it because these labor protest songs feed into stuff from the 20th century. It's kind of a tradition among sort of left-wing labor activists, and then later on civil rights movements, sort of part of that same thing. And actually, this song was written by a guy named Isaac Ballard in 1868. When they actually did pass a law, but wasn't published until 1878, when they began to sort of push for more laws. And in fact, the music was written by a congregational minister. So there's some crossover there in these movements, but just a little snippet of 8 Hours. You can hear this. Yeah, okay, that's enough of that. I just realized I might not have might have the audio from the computer hooked up, but listen to the song if you get a chance. It is interesting. But talking about having 8 hours to think, 8 hours to actually, again, the average work rate for people by 1900 was like 60 hours a week. So that's why they're demanding this stuff and talking about it like that. But it's kind of interesting. They produced hundreds of songs, by the way, about an 8-hour workday. Tons of them. You can Google this stuff in other places. So last part of the lecture, just to put a bow on all this, is again, America becoming an industrial power, linked with this. Again, there's a working class that's kind of global. Actually, this is Marx's idea that it's a global phenomenon that's going on. He's basically correct. That America is part of a global economy. They're doing all this to compete with other nations. And it's good to compare it with Europe because, as I mentioned before, America and observant Europeans knew this would happen once the war was over, once the Civil War was over. But in 1860, the United States was fourth in the world in industrial production output. By the 1890s, it surpassed its closest competitor by double the output, which was Germany. It was going to become the great behemoth. It was too big. It had too many natural resources, coal, oil. Its closest competitor would be Germany. They had sources of coal as well. And all these new technologies, which the American industry was a lot more eager to embrace than other countries in Europe, and led to it becoming that powerful by 1900. And like Germany, it was part of the reason for its growth was increase in population, both through birth and migration. Germany is a good comparison, by the way, because Germany is a modern country, self-consciously modern country like the United States. It's only born in 1871 after Prussia defeats France in the Franco-Prussian War, unites all the various states of Germany, which are disunited, into one country. They see themselves as forward-looking and modern in a way that other European countries don't. It's partly for that reason that that new management style, that new model of the corporation was not widely adopted in places like France and the United Kingdom. There, family firms continued to be the dominant model for a long time afterward. Germany did, however, adopt more of that model of vertical integration than some of its European competitors. And again, probably because Germany was a more self-consciously modern country. These older countries like UK and Britain are different. The UK, even France, again, they've had revolutions and stuff. There's still this prejudice against working with your hands. And of course, in Britain, they still have noble title. You can still become a nobleman over several generations. So just to make a comparison, in the UK, hey, if you're an ambitious person, socially speaking, you may want to make lots of money as a captain in industry, but you'll still be looked down upon because there's a different class structure there. So what do? You build your big business, then you invest, you buy a landed estate, and then so your grandson can inherit the title and become a nobleman or something like that. They have a different set of status markers, whereas in the United States, there's none of that stuff. So you just invest more and more in your company and get more and more stuff, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and so on and so forth. So a different class dynamic makes for a different type of business environment. Another difference is the relative power of labor movements. They're much more powerful in the European spheres of influence. Even though one interesting thing about this, again, going on the sort of global nature, transatlantic nature anyway, of the labor movement, a lot of workers' unions in Europe actually copied the organization of the Knights of Labor. This was actually partly brought back to places like Britain through migration. Remember, you had a lot of Irish coming into the United States. A lot of them went back and brought that pattern with them. So there's some cross pollination there. But in general, European worker parties movements were more successful at getting concessions from government. In fact, there's several reasons for this. One, especially in France and Germany in the late 19th century, but also Britain in the early 20th. And part of the reason for this is, quite frankly, fear of a revolution. Across Europe, you have workers' parties influenced by socialism, by communism springing up. Governments like France and Germany are kind of terrified of this. So there's also a reason for this in places like France, definitely, but also Britain. Again, these are older societies. They have a more paternalist notion of government, that is, say, aristocratic. That is the idea that, the people who run society are like their superior, and their inferiors are basically children who need to be taken care of by them. And so along with the need to placate these more revolutionary types, there is this sense that, okay, it's our duty to do this stuff. And so, and actually, oddly enough, the first country to pass a series of legislation for things like old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and health benefits is actually Germany, 1984. The government of Otto von Bismarck, again, basically almost explicitly for the purpose of heading off complaints from socialist parties. But in general, this was this need. This also happened in Britain in 1911. They passed a law establishing unemployment insurance and old age pensions for the first time, passed by the Liberal Party. The minister who's responsible for this in 1911, you know the names, Winston Churchill. Was a liberal earlier on in his career, later on become a conservative. But at that point, the Liberal Party was trying to head off a challenge from the Labour Party, which was the working party, openly socialist working party in Britain. A couple of other things to note about all this. One of the things that makes possible this industrial output, is the so-called new immigration coming from various places in the 19th century. And it's new in two ways. One is that the scale of it is beyond anything anybody's ever seen. Between 1877 and 1900, 11 million people will come into the United States. Between 1900 and 1914, 13 million more will enter the United States. Some 25 million immigrants will enter the United States by World War I. And now there'd been immigration to the United States from the 1830s and 40s from Europe, from Ireland, but this makes for a very different working class. Again, you'd already had, people of African descent, Native Americans, people of Hispanic descent in the United States, but now from all over the place, particularly Asia and South and Eastern Europe. Such that by 1900, census revealed that 75% of all residents of the cities of San Francisco and New York City in 1900 had at least one foreign-born parent. That is a radical change within a generation, within a lifetime. And this, of course, was made to order for the new industrial barons. They wanted cheap labor, people who would pay lower jobs at lower pay than Native Americans. And during economic downturns, they wouldn't stay around, they would go back home. So you didn't have to pay them health benefits or anything like that. So they were perfect, as immigrants are for most industrial types. And even though some came with skilled labor, most of the new industry required lots of, unskilled labor. So it provided the backbone of this. And we're talking from places like Germany, Scandinavia, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Italy, the Balkans, Italians, Greeks, lots of Eastern European people of Jewish ancestry in the late 19th century as well. Some 3 million people, 3 million Jewish people came from Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe as well. I should mention, by the way, all of this migration was in some ways not necessary, was almost an extension in some ways of patterns of migration in Europe. It was fairly the tradition of agricultural laborers moving around seasonally looking for work, and steamship travel made this easier to do globally. So that's where you get a lot of the stuff coming from, part of a global pattern. And now I should say again, you probably have in your head a lot of sentimental ideas about immigrants from Europe. That's a legacy of being a mostly European settled country. That kind of leniency was not granted to immigrants from Asia, as we've seen. There was Chinese immigrants coming in from 1868. I mentioned this before. You have a law being passed in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which severely restricted a number of Chinese immigrants, which would not be repealed until the 1940s. So, and by the way, that was pushed by labor unions. They're the ones who are pushing for that. That, in fact, most of the big restrictions on immigration you'll see throughout the first part of this course, it's a result mostly of labor trying to restrict competition from immigrants. Nonetheless, by the end of the century, you have not only Chinese, but Korean and Japanese immigrants arriving in the tens of thousands as well in places like California. So all this is reshaping, again, the West, and the West is a big, represents a big change in the nature of the government. And then finally, all that produces a new sort of nativism. Why? Because that new immigration, because it's from Southern and Eastern Europe, because it's full of people who are Jewish and Catholic, this makes American, Anglo-Saxon Protestants nervous. A lot of Protestants question the capability of peoples like Catholics and Jews for sustaining self-government. The idea was they came from places that were despotic, and therefore they questioned their capability for doing that. They question Asians' ability for assimilation. And so you get organized opposition to immigration. You get things like Blaine Amendments. The Blaine Amendments are named for James G. Blaine, who was a secretary of, I think, Commerce, or something like that. He was a cabinet member of the Grant administration. Tried to pass an amendment to the Constitution aimed at banning private schools Why ban private schools? Because they're sectarian. What does sectarian mean? He meant Catholic schools. Again, the idea was, this is a Protestant country, they didn't want parochial schools operating and teaching, teaching loyalty to the Pope, all that stuff. In fact, there was an association called the American Protective Association, which was essentially a secret organization of Protestant workers designed to keep out Catholics, Roman Catholics, out of certain industries. People would swear an oath to oppose the Pope and oppose the Catholic Church. So all that sort of stuff. This is where you get, by the way, and I'll get to this in a couple of weeks. This is part of the move for the standardization of education in the 19th century, the establishment of public school systems. It had as part of its modus operandi, not just to educate people in some generic sense. It was to make them Americans, to make them, like Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's kind of similar to what happens with the Native Americans, on not as forcibly, obviously, but the same idea is operating the same way there. And so you have the growth of all these conflicts as a result of industrialization. I'll end with this thought. One of the things that happens, that was already happening before the Civil War, industrialization and the creation of a self-conscious working class is a real threat to the Republican idea of government that the United States was founded on. And the reason why is it's founded on the idea of, equal citizens who are all independent. Well, this is one of the changes that happens, right? I mean, one of the reasons why, for example, Thomas Jefferson was so opposed to industry and industrial labor was, he thought you can't be independent if you're earning your wage from somebody else. That's why his ideal, and it was very much a utopian ideal, of having small farmers run the country is because they were independent. They worked for themselves. Well, now you have an economy where everybody works for somebody else. Everybody is dependent as a wage laborer. And the development of the labor movement is a way of trying to sort of get out of that and do something about it. But it's a serious problem. It's never really been totally resolved. The New Deal will take care of a lot of this, but recent changes since the 1970s, you'll see the rest of this course, have resurrected this problem, as we've kind of seen in the person of Donald Trump. This problem has recurred, so it's something that affects us directly. So that is the end of that lecture. Hope that guys helps you guys get into the readings for this week. Take a look at them and the major problems. We'll go over this stuff in detail. We'll go through, we'll talk about labor, talk about the industry, talk about the role of workers, women and child labor, all the things that are involved in this in our discussion, and anything else you guys want to sort of get through with. So take care, you guys. I'll see you next week.